All right, it is go time. So again, Shaelynn here. So glad that you are joining us on this afternoon. Yes, this will be recorded. You will receive a follow-up email along with the recording link, links to different things that Jordan is sharing that the ambassadors will speak about. So you will receive all of those links in a follow-up email. A little bit about the News Literacy Project. If you are brand new to who we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit education organization, and we support educators across the nation developing free resources, programs, and curriculum. Some of the best lessons are housed on our flagship program called Checkology, and this is our newest Checkology lesson that we are going to speak about this afternoon. So we are thrilled not only to share this lesson with you, but also to have some of our NLP ambassadors join us to talk about how they would use this in the classroom. Again, joined by my colleagues, Peter and Jordan, along with two ambassadors who will introduce themselves in a moment. But I definitely did want to give a brief shout out because again, we create curriculum, lessons, resources, everything's free for educators with the help and support of grants and funders. And actually this lesson was made possible from the Herb Block Foundation, and it's the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists. So we are thankful for their support. This lesson called The Power of Art was made possible again with support from the Herb Block Foundation and the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists. I'll tell you, Peter, this is something that I don't typically see in a lot of curricula out there. I know it's especially important for middle school educators, editorial cartooning. So a couple questions before we get started here. Why Lalo? Why did we choose Lalo to be the leader of the learning? All of our lessons are taught by subject matter experts, but why Lalo?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. That's always a big part of our process when we're designing a new lesson. We really search for the right subject matter expert for each topic. And, Lalo is among the most prominent and provocative voices in editorial cartooning today. He was a finalist. I don't know if anybody's aware, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in editorial cartooning last year, which was the first time in 48 years that the Pulitzer Board did not award a Pulitzer Prize in editorial cartooning because there aren't enough consensus among the board. But the editorial cartooning community kind of felt like Lalo was robbed on that, and a lot of people agree. I think he'll be up again maybe this year, so it's kind of interesting for students to pay attention to that. And we really wanted to make sure this lesson addressed the field of editorial cartooning's historic lack of diversity and inclusion in a meaningful way. And we wanted to be sure to select a subject matter expert who could meaningfully speak to that. Journalism as a field, right, struggles with diversity and inclusion, but especially editorial cartooning as a sort of subset of that industry. And then we also wanted a subject matter expert who could speak to kind of where the field is going and where the form is headed and some of the challenges. As newspapers disappear, once upon a time in the 70s, there were way more newspapers and most of them had a full-time editorial cartoonist, and there were way more editorial cartoonists producing editorial cartoons at the local level. And we're down to like 35 full-time editorial cartoonists in the country. But other folks are self-publishing online. So the form is changing. And Lalo very much, still publishes traditional single panel editorial cartoons or two panel editorial cartoons, but he also publishes other comics. His publication, La Cucaracha, is a good example. And so we really wanted someone who could help bridge that history right into the modern day and help students really explore some of those issues looking forward.
As I said earlier, Checkology is our flagship platform. It is completely free for students and teachers. It contains lessons that help students develop critical thinking skills around news and media literacy. We work very hard to develop those skills, teaching kids how to think about the information in the news they consume, not what to think. Peter, do you feel the top 3 lessons NLP hopes students walk away with from this newest lesson?
Sure. I think, first of all, I think it's important that students have an appreciation for the role that editorial cartooning has played throughout history into today, right? As a kind of unique form of opinion journalism. And the history is so rich and so interesting that, as soon as the printing press technology advanced to the point where graphics like this could be mass produced, they took on just an enormous amount of power, even at a time when literacy rates were much lower than they are today. People could immediately see an editorial cartoon and take away meaning. So it broadened the audience for opinion journalism in a way that's truly remarkable. There's also just an immediacy and a provocation aspect to visual graphic political expression, especially editorial cartooning, that moved people. And the example of Thomas Nast and Boss Tweed, for example, is a good one, right? Journalists at the time were covering the corruption of that administration in New York City, but it wasn't until Nast sort of made it real with pictures and people could pass them around. So there's also these parallels to memes, the way people can just easily share and pass things that we were really interested in with this topic. And so I hope, this helps students sort of draw some of those parallels and give them an appreciation for that role. It also just really underscores the watchdog role of the press generally. And that's another sort of through line that we can follow. And then finally, I hope it helps students think more about graphic political expression, ethics, accuracy. So, editorial and political cartoonists play by some rules like journalists, right? They base their opinions on accurate information. They can be provocative, but they have to base their opinions on facts. Whereas memes and other things that take things out of context, less so. So we hope it sort of sparks some of those conversations and thoughts and more inquiry with students around those issues.
That's great. And Peter's going to stay on during this webinar. He will be here for any questions and answers at the very end. So be sure to pop those in. Let us know if you have any questions about the lesson or about what people are speaking. Our NLP ambassador, Adriana, brings up a great point. She says, Lalo loves to speak to students. He loves doing that. It's so wonderful. Just so you know, be sure to join our NewsLit Nation. You'll receive the Insider each month, and working with Peter to get Lalo to do an EdWeb webinar at the beginning of the school for back to school. So be sure to join and get that update of when we could possibly be joined by Lalo to talk about this lesson and talk about editorial cartooning and memes. That's interesting that you bring that up, Peter, because that is the way of information and jokes for many of our students. So I'm going to pass this over to Jordan. She's going to tell you about an awesome opportunity for not only those joining us, but if you want to use this lesson in your classroom, there could be an NLP connection. Jordan, I'm going to pass this over to you.
Yeah, we're really excited to get some footage of teachers teaching this lesson with students in the classroom. So if you're interested potentially in using this lesson with students and having a film crew or a photographer in your classroom, we'd love to hear from you. This could occur this spring, ideally, or maybe even early next school year. You can contact me at jmays@newslit.org if you're interested. I'm going to pop my email address in the chat. You can also just contact anyone at NLP and we'll be sure to put you in touch with the right people. So again, if you'd be interested in having you and your students filmed using the editorial cartooning lesson in action, please get in touch with us and we'd love to hear from you. So I'm really excited to dive into this new lesson. If you don't already have a Checkology account, I recommend that you create one today. Again, it's totally free. And once you've created your teacher account, when you log in, the first thing that you're going to see is this dashboard. You might have some classes already loaded. If you don't, you can add one by clicking here. And there are two ways that you can access this lesson from your teacher account. The first one is by editing your course that you've already created for students. You can click View Edit Course to do that. And the second one is by clicking into the Content tab. So if you just want to check out the lesson first before you assign it to students, click into Content. You'll see our core lessons listed here under Learn. And then when you scroll to the bottom, you will see the editorial cartooning lesson. You can click Preview to open it in a new tab. To prepare to use this lesson, you might also want to use our lesson guide. The easiest way to access the lesson guide for editorial cartooning is from this Help button. Click on the Lesson Guides button here. And then you'll see that Power in Art, the watchdog role of editorial cartooning, is situated within our Exercising Civic Freedoms strand. And here you'll get everything that you need to prepare to use the lesson with students. We've got a lesson overview, which give you some key classroom environment pieces of information. We've got our learning objectives and essential questions for the lesson. And then we've got a full lesson guide. This contains the text from all of the videos in the lesson, the answers to the assessments, word wall words, and more. So again, from your teacher account, to access those lesson guides, click on that help button and then lesson guides, and you'll have everything that you need to prepare to use this in the classroom. So I'm excited to demo this lesson with you. The lesson contains 4 chapters. And the first chapter is about some background about editorial cartooning in general and its relationship to opinion journalism, and then the early history of editorial cartooning. So I'm going to dig into chapter 1 from a social studies perspective, and then I'll turn it over to our awesome ambassadors to talk about this lesson in the context of some other disciplines. So like other Checkology lessons, you can navigate in your teacher account using these dots at the bottom. You can skip ahead to any element you'd like to, but your students will be required to go through chronologically. You can use this next button to advance as well. And you have access to the word wall, which contains vocabulary and news literacy topics from the lesson. So I'm going to X out of the word wall and we'll get started. So Lalo, our subject matter expert, has a 2-part introduction. And we're going to go ahead and watch the second part of his introduction to set us up for this lesson. I'm going to enable captions. All of our videos on Checkology have English captions, and click play.
So I should probably introduce myself. I'm Lalo Alcaraz, and I've been drawing editorial cartoons since I was in college. I've been published in newspapers all over the US, Mexico, and the world. I believe strongly in the power and the value of editorial cartoons. I'm a Chicano artist, and I often incorporate cultural imagery in my work that Latinos, Mexicans, and Mexican Americans would be familiar with. I use editorial cartoons to advocate for the Latino community and immigrants in particular. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the unique and, from my perspective, amazing form of opinion journalism that is editorial cartooning. We'll walk through the history of editorial and political cartoons and view some important examples together. We'll also think about how these drawings can play a watchdog role in democracy, testing boundaries, pushing buttons, exposing wrongdoing, and holding powerful people accountable for their actions, and making some of them pretty darn angry in the process. I know my drawings have. In some cases, this has resulted in cartoonists being harassed, threatened, jailed, tortured, or even killed for their work. So what makes editorial cartoons an effective and powerful form of expression? Why do they elicit strong responses, including from those in power? I mean, they're just drawings, right? Well, let's see about that.
All right, so we've set the stage for editorial cartooning. I wanted to mention, by the way, that if you see any ideas for implementation here, if you have any notes about what you would do in the classroom, we'd love to hear them. Please just pop them in the chat. After this introduction from Lalo, students see 2 examples. They see a cartoon and an article that are both opinion pieces, and they're asked to list 3 ways that they're similar, and then in the next lesson element, they're asked to list 3 ways that they're different. From a social studies perspective, I could see taking 2 paths to kind of extend on this assessment. The first one could be that I could take a screenshot of the cartoon on the left-hand side by itself, and I could present it to students on its own without any context, maybe even as a pre-thinking activity. And then I can ask them questions for contextualization, for historical reading skills, like when and where do you think this cartoon was created and how do you know? The nurse's outfit could help you narrow it down, but what else here helps us place this cartoon in its historical context? Students might notice that the face shield is an object that's commonly used in the present day, and that could help them contextualize the cartoon. And this sort of pre-thinking activity sets students up well for the assessment. Another path I could take is even presenting students with a blank timeline. Could have them create one as well. And as they go through the lesson, they can fill in the timeline with these examples of editorial cartoons and the corresponding historical events that go along with them. And this sort of activity might set the stage to use examples from the lesson to practice all of our historical reading skills, sourcing, corroboration, and close reading. So if you're looking for opportunities to really bring this home in a social studies or history context, those are a couple of ways that you can do so with this assessment. After students list 3 ways that they're similar, Again, they're asked to list 3 ways that they're different. Student responses will save to their progress, and when they submit the lesson to you, you will see what they've done in your account, and you will be prompted to evaluate their work. Let's check out what Lalo has to say next.
So when did editorial cartooning begin? A long time ago. Many cartoon scholars believe that the first cartoons were drawn by the ancient Egyptians, and that the first political cartoon was an unflattering portrait of an officer drawn by a Roman soldier on the walls of his barracks in the city of Pompeii almost 2,000 years ago. These kinds of exaggerated figures in cartoons are called caricatures. From there, drawings expressing opinions about important issues and those satirizing or mocking people in power appeared throughout history. But the form really picked up momentum in the mid to late 1700s, around the time of the Industrial Revolution. This was also when discontent among the American colonies was rising against England, and when many scholars think the first American political cartoon was made. In 1754, Benjamin Franklin drew this: a cartoon that used a snake cut up into pieces as a symbol for the American colonies. Franklin added the words "join or die." The cartoon was published in Franklin's newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, alongside an editorial he wrote urging the colonies to unite during the French and Indian War.
So that join or die cartoon is one that many of you history teachers may already use in the classroom. If you teach early American history, you're probably used to teaching without as many visuals to draw from because we don't have photography from that era, of course. So you already know that helping students learn to interpret images that aren't photographs is a crucial skill because students need to know that it's not raw information from the past. You can take this opportunity to make connections to what you've already discussed on this image in class. You can also ask students to compare and contrast the join or die cartoon, for example, with the first cartoon that they saw about COVID-19. And if you're using a timeline with them, you can ask them to place this cartoon on that timeline. After that video from Lalo, we've got a student assessment that you see on screen. And this assessment checks for understanding of a new term that was just introduced, caricature, which again, you can find here in the word wall if you scroll down a little bit. But you can also extend this assessment for your own conversations if the other cartoons in this assessment are helpful in your learning environment. For example, the drawing of the Boston Massacre on the right is used in history classrooms as a drawing with a clear point of view. The British here are depicted as being the clear perpetrators of violence, but if you check out primary source documents from the trial, you'll see that this drawing might not have been an accurate depiction. You can ask students whether, for example, the cartoon is ethical and whether it might even be propaganda, which you'll also find a definition of in the word wall. Another extension you could do is to use reverse image search, which is an important digital verification skill about which we have resources on Checkology to figure out what some of these cartoons are if you don't already know. So for example, if students aren't familiar with the cartoon in the center, you can have them take a screenshot and do a reverse image search of that screenshot to see if they can find some contextualizing information. Next, we have an assessment about the historical context of the join or die cartoon. And then we dig into the French Revolution.
Around this same time, France was in the midst of its own political revolution, driven by a desire for greater freedom and laws that were more democratic. After the revolution ended in 1830, a journalist and caricaturist named Charles Philippon took aim at the new king, Louis Philippe. Two of these drawings criticizing Louis Philippe landed Philippon in court, charged with insulting the king. During the second trial, Philippon came up with a provocative defense. He argued, using an actual drawing, that anything could be made to look like the king, even a pear, and that it would therefore be unjust to hold him accountable for the king's resemblance to other things. Oh, and perhaps not so coincidentally, the French word for pear is also slang for fool. So it seems Philippon managed to sneak in another jab with his court performance. He was found guilty of contempt of the king's person and was fined and sent to prison. But thanks to his stunt in court, the pear became a symbol of resistance to authority and later appeared in other cartoons, paintings, and even novels. Philippon's pear drawing highlights two important points about editorial cartoons. First, they involve symbols that act as a kind of visual shorthand for things. And some popular symbols, like Uncle Sam to represent the United States, or the donkey and the elephant to represent the Democratic and Republican parties, or the pear as resistance in France, were first introduced by an editorial cartoonist and then adopted as cultural conventions. The second point is one I've already shared, but it's worth saying again. Editorial cartoons often make people, and especially people in power, really mad. And sometimes that means cartoonists like Charles Philippon are punished, and that's really no laughing matter. Of course, things have changed since then. Philippon wouldn't be convicted of insulting the president in modern-day France, for example, but in many countries around the world, cartoonists and other journalists are still targeted for their work.
So a conversation about symbols, I believe, is really rich for a social studies classroom. Talking about how symbols change meaning over time in different historical contexts, I think is a great point of conversation for this video and for the assessment. And if you'd like to extend that to other examples, for example, you could harken back to the Join or Die cartoon and ask students if they've seen the symbol in any contemporary context, and if so, to describe how the symbol has come to change meaning over time. So here students are asked about the significance of this cartoon in terms of its relations to press freedoms. And that ends chapter 1. So in chapter 1, we've gone over the role of editorial cartooning within the landscape of opinion journalism, and we've talked about the early history of editorial cartooning. Next up, we have Adriana, who's going to speak about chapter 2. And while Adriana is getting her screen share set up, Molly is going to talk about Molly and Adriana's roles as news literacy ambassadors within LP.
Thanks, Jordan. Hi, everyone. My name is Molly June Roquet. I'm the education librarian at St. Mary's College of California in the San Francisco Bay Area. And prior to that, a long time school librarian and teacher. Happy to be here. And I wanted to just mention briefly, Adriana and I are both news literacy ambassadors, which means we're here to support you in your own news literacy efforts on your campus as a resource, as someone to provide support. You can find more information about all of us, and if you're not in one of our areas in the San Francisco Bay Area or Los Angeles, find out who your sort of most local news literacy ambassador is on NewsLit Nation. That's at the News Literacy Project website. You'll click on the For Educators link. You'll find a form there with lots of rich discussion about ways to incorporate news literacy concepts into instruction, as well as a list of events and ambassadors in your area. So lots of wonderful resources there. And I'll go ahead and hand it off to Adriana.
Hi, and welcome. My name is Adriana Chavira, and I teach high school right here in Los Angeles. I teach journalism. I teach an introductory course that's primarily made up of 9th graders. And I also advise the newspaper, news magazine, and yearbook at my high school. So pretty much all day I do teach journalism. I am an English teacher as well, but once in a while I will teach a course of English, but I haven't been a full English teacher in probably about 12 years. And so before I go into the lesson, I'm going to give you a little bit about what I really love about this lesson, and also a little bit about my background. So I've been using Checkology in my classroom for about 6 years now. I think since when they primarily started. And I primarily use it in my freshman class, which is my introductory to journalism. And I'm really excited about this new Powers Art, the watchdog role of editorial cartoonist module for several reasons. One is that I teach a unit on opinion writing, and this Checkology module will definitely supplement my curriculum. And two, the history of political cartoons in these lessons features a wealth of information. The history of political cartoons is something I usually don't go much into. And so, just watching or, going through the module myself last week, I learned so much, and I know my students will really enjoy that as well. 3 of these lessons drive the point home of journalists and cartoonists as watchdogs of government, and that's something that I usually go through. But I think this one, just watching and hearing the different examples will really drive it home for students. And the lessons also explain several terms such as propaganda and stereotypes. And then 4, I enjoyed viewing the diversity of the cartoonists featured in these lessons, specifically Latinos and women. One of my favorites featured, aside from Lalo Alcaraz, who I've known for like 20 years or more, is Jose Guadalupe Posada, whom I've mostly thought of as a muralist and not as much as a editorial cartoonist. So I really learned a lot from that. And actually, I'm wearing his earrings today just because I really was really surprised and excited about the video that they have on him here. And so I'm going to play it for you right now. Let me see, find out. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. All right.
Another cartoonist who began his career around this same time with some striking similarities. One of the most influential Latin American artists in history. Posada began his professional cartooning career at a local newspaper in his hometown of Aguascalientes, Mexico, in 1871, when he was still a teenager. But according to historical accounts and the Posada Art Foundation, the paper soon closed down and Posada left town because a powerful local politician was offended by one of his cartoons. Posada was a renowned publisher and printmaker who often distributed his cartoons in broadsides or single sheets printed on one side. He lived most of his life during the reign of the Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz, who held on to power for 30 years and whose corruption led to great wealth inequality throughout the country. Lots of fodder for political cartoonists. Posada is best known for his calaveras, traditional Mexican skulls and skeletons that many people associate with Dia de los Muertos. But Posada used calaveras.
Oops. Sorry.
In the later part of the 19th century, the popularity of epidemic, prohibition, the Great Depression, the Second World War, McCarthy.
1 second, I think not sure what happened there. Sorry about that. My mouse pad is very sensitive. All right, let me backtrack. It was number 15.
No worries at all. And I think this is a great opportunity to, like, it's hard to keep all of the lesson elements and all of that and keep track of them. But if you have the full lesson guide open when you're using this in the classroom, that can help find where your place is. And if you're having video issues in the classroom too, then you can use the full lesson guide as a supplement because you have the text of all the videos there. So I just wanted to mention that to everybody as kind of a plug for our full lesson guide.
I'm sorry about that. Go ahead.
Oh, I was done. Thank you, Adriana. Thanks for letting me interrupt.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, let me just continue just a little bit. I think where we left off.
And whose corruption led to great wealth inequality throughout the country. Lots of fodder for political cartoonists. Posada is best known for his calaveras, traditional Mexican skulls and skeletons that many people associate with Dia de los Muertos. But Posada used calaveras as satirical devices, kind of like visual poems, to comment on social and political issues and to remind everyone that death is democratic, that the upper classes may have nicer clothes and fancy hats, but at the end of life, they're just like the rest of us.
All right, and then the next one that I'm going to use is, let's see, maybe this one. All right, so before I go into this next module or the assessment that they give you, for me, the way I use Checkology in my classroom is I usually give students some time, about 30 minutes, usually on Thursdays or Fridays, to work on this in class. I usually have it as an in-class assignment. And I think these lessons here with the power of art can be modified in an English class as well, because in English classes, you also teach persuasive writing, which is what opinion writing is. And these editorial cartoons definitely lend themselves into that sort of unit because students are very creative. I know I have a lot of very talented artistic students. And so I think this is one way for them to also express themselves and, what they're feeling, what they're thinking. And so I already taught my unit on opinion writing this year, so I haven't used these lessons, but as I watched through the lessons, this new module, I started thinking about, ways to incorporate it into my classroom and my curriculum that I use. And so this one, I will definitely use it next time I use opinion writing. And in addition to this one, I will also use Checkology's Arguments and Evidence, which is one that I really enjoy as well, and also Understanding Bias, because they really lend themselves to opinion writing. And as part of my opinion writing, students write an opinion article and I walk them through that, but then also I have them I have them draw a cartoon, editorial cartoon that goes along with their article. And so that's why when I saw this, I was like, oh, this is going to be a lot more, because I don't go too much into the history of it. So this one is perfect. And then I usually have students come up with topics. And I think just even this assessment, which is just one question, will help them come up with an idea that they want to focus on. And I usually have them focus on something that's for teens, or, something that teens are, concerned about, because sometimes if the article and the cartoon are really well done, I usually have my editors publish them in our news website. So I just really like this question. Just imagine you are an editorial cartoonist and have a deadline for a new cartoon. What issue or event would you express an opinion about? And then I like how they add symbols, caricatures, or satire, and because that's something that I go over it, but not as much. And I think when students see the examples here in these lessons, it'll drive home the point, and they're like, okay, that's what caricatures look like, or that's what a satire looks like. And so I think this will really help them come up with a really good topic for them to do. And so they write their answers here, and that's what I like the assessments that Checkology has, because students write them and then they can go on, and then I'll check them, and I pretty much just check to make sure that they're on the right track. And then they write something. So for example, one huge thing that a lot of my students wrote about this time was homework overload. And that's actually one that we actually published, I think about a month ago. And so I had one student write it, and then we actually used a cartoon from another student. And then let me see what else. All right, so I'm a writing teacher. I teach photography as well. I do not draw, and I know pretty much nothing about drawing. I still draw like I did back when I was in kindergarten. So what I do for when I get to the editorial cartoon is I let students use a website app called Storyboard That, and that they can draw their cartoons there. It's pretty much just pick and choose some elements, and it's fairly easy to use, but still about 3/4 of the students do draw it by hand, or they use the app Procreate, where it's a computerized app that they use on their iPads. But there's just a small portion who maybe don't feel comfortable or don't know how to draw, and they use that as that app called Storyboard That. It's free, and they really enjoy having that, playing around with it. So in case you have any students who maybe don't know how to draw, you can just use that. But for the most part, the students will really like this because they get to use another of their creative elements or juices to create this. And then another lesson that I like from this chapter 2, is one on the problems with editorial cartooning, such as stereotypes and some racism as well. And it brings the point home of why it's wrong to, stereotype people. So I'm going to show you a snippet of that one now. And let me see, it's number 22. Let's see. Okay, so I'm gonna play it now.
Let's pause here and talk about a couple of the problems with editorial cartooning, starting with the use of racist and sexist stereotypes and tropes throughout most of the history of editorial cartooning we've covered so far. Cartooning is a visual art, and to get their messages across, political cartoonists need to be able to convey opinions about complex subjects in a small amount of space, often with just a single cartoon panel or image. That means editorial cartoons need to be efficient and use visual elements that are symbolic or representative of other things. Often, cartoonists need to find a way to represent a group of people, like students, parents, or corporate leaders. And a good way to do this is to use something called an archetype, or an easy to recognize character that is intended to represent a larger group. For example, here's a cartoon I drew in 2021 that includes an archetype of a farm worker. I used a single figure to represent this entire group of people. I didn't draw it in a negative or unfair way that diminished farm workers' dignity or humanity. I drew it with respect. But sometimes cartoonists and others use harmful representations that do invoke derogatory, meaning disrespectful, and unfair ideas or preconceived notions about a group of people. When used in this way, these are called negative stereotypes. Throughout history, harmful stereotypes have often been used to represent racial and ethnic groups and women, any group perceived as other. The outright racism and sexism of these images is shocking to us today, but it's also an important reminder of just how socially acceptable it was to express extreme prejudice in popular culture, including in news publications designed to inform the public. Today, the use of overtly offensive stereotypes in editorial cartoons is much less common and prompts much more outrage. But these stereotypes still make an appearance from time to time.
All right, so that one does bring up a good discussion. And so I have a pretty diverse student population at my school. And so usually, students will be quick to point out anything that they see as racist or stereotypical. And so, just watching this segment would, I know would get them to talk and ask questions and some, bring up some lively discussions in the classroom as well. And so that's going to wrap up my section of my lessons or from chapter 2. And so it's going to be next is Molly June with the next part of the lesson. And if you have any other questions, feel free to add them in the chat.
All right, thank you, Adriana. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to pick up right where she left off. My background is as a school librarian. I was at a K-8 school for about a decade and did a lot of teaching around media and news literacy. I wanted to talk I'm going to mostly talk about chapters 3 and 4, but I wanted to come back just to this element in chapter 2 and talk about it a little bit from a media literacy perspective. Because I think there's a really valuable discussion and sort of extensions that can come out of this with kids. I think as librarians, we've had a lot of conversations. They're certainly not resolved, they're ongoing, but conversations about racist stereotypes and racist depictions in books and what to do with those books and how to deal with those books on the shelf. But I think there's also a lot more to talk about in terms of helping kids recognize sort of the persistence of racist stereotypes and racist tropes, especially in our visual culture, that sort of remain as often a shorthand for talking about groups of people. And I think the way Lalo sort of set that up helps us understand that the way those sort of appear over and over again, and I think can lead to really rich conversations about, I think especially in sort of visuals, the enduring persistence of some of that in contexts that are really complicated to talk about. So for example, anthropomorphic primates in children's books. Curious George books on the shelf in many libraries, and I'm not starting a debate about whether or not they should be, but there's a history there, right, of anthropomorphizing people of color that led to that being sort of a shorthand in children's literature and in American visual culture. So I just really appreciate that sort of starting point and that context that I think will be meaningful and approachable for students. I'm going to highlight just a few parts of chapters 3 and 4. And chapter 3, we're sort of taking what we've learned and we're going to look at some editorial cartoons, meet some editorial cartoonists, hear about sort of their background and how they've gotten to this work and what it means to them, and then see some of their work as well. The first, let me make sure, oh, I need to share with sound here. The first cartoonist we meet is named Michael Ramirez. I'll show you a little bit of his introduction and then him talking about sort of how he got into cartoons and the impact that that's had.
Hi, I'm Michael Ramirez, the editorial cartoonist at the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and I'm syndicated with Creator Syndicate. I've been a political cartoonist for about 40 years. I may be the only cartoonist who never wanted to be a cartoonist. I wanted to be a cardiovascular surgeon. I think of all the lives I saved by being a journalist instead. You know, in college, I actually wrote, and what you'll find out in high schools and college, that if you write to companies, media companies, you can get free tickets to things and free CDs and free music just by doing reviews. And that's how I started my journalistic career. It wasn't until later that I stumbled upon political cartooning. When I did a cartoon on a student election because my editor saw me doodling and realized that I could draw. I realized that in all my writings, they had very little impact. But after I drew that one cartoon on the student election, we had 3 days worth of protests. But wow, what a profound implication these little drawings had. What a great impact. I think
I love that story of sort of his background, and I love that example for students. One of the things I always tried to do as a librarian, you know, the library is different than the classroom. It's a community space and in many ways a platform for the entire school. And one thing I always tried to do was make a library space that could serve as a space for student activism, for student organizing, for student advocacy, really for students to do the things they care about and advocate for the things they care about. And I love Michael's example here because it shows the power that editorial cartooning can have. And I think for many students, that can be an approachable and sort of low stakes way to express themselves and express themselves about complicated issues. You know, whether it's dress codes, whether it's national issues, whether it's the sort of censorship efforts that we're seeing on campus now. You know, writing can be intimidating for students and it can be a bigger hurdle. But drawing for many students, and I'm not saying it's less of an art form or less demanding, but it's less intimidating for students to express themselves that way. And I think that the example that Michael gives there is so inspirational for students. He shares a number of his other cartoons, one of them about Vladimir Putin, very much relevant right now, and one about the World Health Organization and the sort of controversy over transparency and the influence of the Chinese government. From there, we meet, and I'm skipping over some of the interactive elements here, but similar to what Jordan and Adriana shared, there's lots of those as well. We meet another cartoonist, Signe Wilkinson. Here she is introducing herself.
Hi, my name is Signe Wilkinson, and I have been an editorial cartoonist for newspapers in Philadelphia for most of my life. However, I actually started when I was in high school, about your age, and like some of you, I doodled down the side of my history, English, and math notes. I drew teachers and other students. My first political...
And I will say, having had many authors and illustrators visit my libraries, when authors come and they talk about, you know, how they got into writing, and it's oftentimes, oh, I was always writing in class and I love creative writing assignments and so on. You see that connects with some students. But when illustrators come, sometimes authors as well, and they say, oh, the way I sort of express my creativity is doodling in class. And you see 2/3 of the students go, yep, me too, and the teachers. That's a shared experience that a lot of us have that Signe's tapping into here. And I wanted to share her speaking about one of her cartoons, because I really like the way she sets this up, and I think there's a lot of directions this could take in a classroom discussion.
This is an early cartoon before I really learned how to draw, so don't mind the art. But it still needs no words to understand. People who believe abortion should be legal love this image. Those who think it should be outlawed, not so much. It's the power of the image itself without words that makes this so universally understood, whether you like it or hate it. Because of that, even though it's 30 years old and the caricature as of the late George H.W. Bush, it still gets shared on Twitter and Facebook when abortion is in the news.
So again, just what a great sort of example for kids. And I love that she prefaces it by saying, you know, this isn't my greatest work in terms of the art, but that's almost secondary to the message. And when you think about sort of media literacy skills, sorry, I just saw what Shaelynn said in the chat. Yeah, I love that it's often a way for students to feel comfortable mocking teachers and making fun of teachers in a sometimes disrespectful, but sometimes sort of respectful way that they feel allowed to, which can be really powerful. Anyway, this cartoon, I love how she sets it up by saying it's not my greatest art, and that's not what matters so much. But when we think about sort of media literacy, being able to understand the meaning and the message behind nonverbal communication, images without text is so powerful. So, you know, I would pause here and bring in a lot of other examples of, you know, from books, from advertising, from political media, helping students to recognize, like, what is the message here and what is the story. And I mentioned sort of advocacy. You know, the other thing, like Adriana said, in library classes, we're often working on sort of argument and helping students to develop their skills in like putting an argument together and marshaling evidence or perspective in service of something. It's such an important skill. And in school, so often that's paired with writing. Writing, obviously, also an incredibly important skill. But sometimes asking students to do both at the same time is a big challenge. Like, it is two big tasks. And we're like, you got to do this and then do this at the same time for the same assignment. Again, drawing, not that it's easier or less intense, but it's much more approachable for students in a way that they can really clearly communicate to their community and share their thinking. Signa shares another wonderful cartoon about school funding. School funding is already fair. Oops.
The reason I like
it's paused there. It is a great cartoon. And then there's also some activities to sort of discuss these cartoons and think about them, similar to what we've seen elsewhere. Great activity. Chapter 4, we're back with Lalo, and he brings us sort of up to date on the recent history of editorial cartooning and the way the recent history around the news industry in general has impacted that. And I'll show you just a little bit of his discussion here.
You started this lesson about the role that editorial cartooning has played in public debate since it first took shape hundreds of years ago. But what about where it's going? How is this important form of opinion journalism changing? And where is it headed? I wish I had an easy answer to that question, but I don't. The truth is that there are now far fewer newspapers and political cartoonists employed by them than there were 50 years ago. Many cities and towns across the U.S. have lost their local paper, and with it, the voice of a local or
I'll go ahead and pause it there. I think that's such an important discussion to have with kids. And again, a place that, depending on the time I'd have, I would stop and bring some other sort of conversation and evidence in as well. When we look at media literacy education, I think one of the things we're often missing is teaching kids to understand or look for the context of publishing and of the news industry. So, you know, I live in a news desert and I see the effects of that every day. And I think for students to really develop their literacy around the news, it's not just the ability to assess and sort of evaluate news sources, but also understand the way that the changing economy, the social and political and economic context sort of impact our media landscape and the experience we have with it. So talking about consolidation and the closure of newsrooms and what that means, not just in a lack of coverage, but in a diminished sort of public square for debate and humor and even mockery around public issues can have a real impact. So it's such an important discussion to have. And then we'll get to near the end of the lesson here and something I think Peter mentioned at the beginning and you may have been thinking of, which is the other or another sort of major political visual communication form, which you might already be thinking of.
Then there are memes, muchos memes, and they actually have some things in common with editorial cartoons. They use images and text. They often express a point of view about an issue or event. They're efficient and transmit ideas quickly, and they're often very funny.
And I'm going to cut forward a little bit there just because there's a lot of great discussion here, but he brings in a really interesting and I think rich area of discussion.
It's true that memes make graphic political expression more accessible, but when they're made with no editorial standards and no commitment to facts, then they're nothing more than propaganda. Weapons in a partisan information war that distorts and flattens the national conversation about important issues.
That's such a succinct encapsulation of this huge thing that I think you could talk about with kids really fruitfully for a long time, which is sort of authority and accountability, and of course, truth as well. So much of news literacy is us helping kids to sort of assess information for validity and perspective and bias, enormously important. But you can also talk again about sort of the context around that. We talked earlier about racist depictions and the lack of representation in editorial cartooning. And that's in some ways one of the downsides of sort of gatekeeping and having power in editors. There's a lack of access, especially for historically marginalized groups. And sometimes racist depictions or offensive depictions that come out of that. So gatekeeping has a really negative impact. It can also have a really positive impact in providing accountability and ensuring that editorial cartoons or memes, in this case, are sort of hitting an editorial standard of truth and accuracy. On the other hand, we have memes. Anyone can make a meme. There's a sort of democratic nature to it, and I can make a meme about anything, whether it's true or not, and post it to social media. There's a downside of that no one's checking. No one's going to remove it if it's not true. But on the other hand, there's this sort of democratic, egalitarian nature to it that it creates access for everyone. Really important discussion. And then, of course, if you want to go a step further, is it really an egalitarian marketplace of ideas? Because there are algorithms, driven by other concerns that are deciding what we see online and sort of deciding what content gets amplified. So, that's a little beyond this lesson. There's tons of stuff to talk about just with editorial cartooning, but I really appreciate how this lesson brings in all these concepts that are really, really important in media literacy and helping kids navigate that. Before I end my piece, I just wanted to mention the American Association of School Librarian Standards that are relevant here. There are a lot of them because this lesson touches on so many parts of media and information literacy. And of course, a lot of what we do in libraries is not just our own instruction, but collaborating with subject teachers and classroom teachers. And there's really rich opportunities for that too. And I mentioned social justice and sort of community activism. Because they can be so quick and sort of feel low stakes for students, I think they're also a great exit ticket or formative assessment. And finally, really quickly, I wanted to mention, in other contexts, so I used to run a school trip to Washington, D.C. every year for our 7th graders. And I ran it with a history teacher who did a lot of curriculum around editorial cartoons. And we always were trying to figure out what's the best way at the end of the day. Students have been to all these sites, they've been to all these museums and historic sites, and we want them to spend a little time processing what they've seen and processing their experiences. But asking them to write after a long day when they're exhausted and they sort of just want to tune out is difficult for them and for us, frankly. And one thing we came up with was having a daily sort of low stakes editorial cartoon contest. There wasn't even really a winner, but just some sort of encouragement for students to think about something they saw that they really liked, that they really disagreed with, an experience they had that was meaningful, and turn that into a cartoon with a perspective. And students really loved this. It was a really wonderful way to sort of build some community in sharing their experiences and their perspectives. And I think that's the power that visual media can have sometimes, that when we ask students to write something, if it works out really well, that can happen, but there's just a bigger barrier. So I think this lesson could be a wonderful lead-in to giving students some experiences around that. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing and wrap up there.
Wow, I just learned so much from both of you. Thank you so much for your time and for your contributions to this. I feel like I had a lot of questions as you two went through, but then you ended up answering all of them. So I'm curious what questions other panelists have, as well as our attendees. Please pop them in the chat or the Q&A.
I know that people were dropping in messages. I do want to tell everyone, and I cut and pasted Jamie's for her. Don't forget it defaults to host and panelists. So Molly, Jamie had a message for you, so I posted it for you. But yes, definitely drop in questions either for our panelists or for our educators. I have a question, Jordan, just with the whole discussion on memes, which I think is fantastic, because I completely agree. I always thought is that today's contemporary political cartoon. And so I love those connections. Do you think memes are still a big thing with your students? Are you seeing them still use memes? It was huge when I was in the classroom, but now I'm seeing more like TikTok small nuances. I don't know if they're called memes or what those would be called, Peter, but not memes, but parodies almost. But are memes still a thing, do you think, in the classroom with students?
I think so. I mean, I see Adriana's nodding, and I mean, I would defer to folks who are actively in the classroom right now. It's been a bit since I've been there, but as you know, my understanding, and then I'll make one more comment about that after they do.
Yeah, I mean, kids still love memes. We even have for one of our spirit days now is meme day, which for me, I've had a hard time trying to conceptualize how that's going to come out, but kids really love that. We've had it at least twice this school year now. So yeah, they still are. Obviously, TikTok is huge, but kids still love their memes.
Yeah, likewise, I'd say memes is very much still a thing, but you're right. There's sort of another sort of literacy that I think could be connected there around video media, especially the sort of like the TikTok videos where it's people pointing and then text shows up. It's somewhere in between, right? It's a video, but it's also this sort of text-based, quick, humorous sharing of a political or social viewpoint. So a lot of the same skills and a lot of the same, I think, importance that we teach kids how to do it well, but also how to assess what they're looking at.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's an opportunity to look at how memes themselves are changing and dynamic. What are considered mimetic, chunks of cultural production and political messaging online, and how that's changing. GIFs arguably are mimetic. They have meaning when they're used as a reply, and so that's just another facet that you could get into.
I've got a question from Nancy in the chat. What's a good way to describe the difference in context between memes and editorial art? Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of similarities, right? In the lesson, Lalo points out that editorial cartoons all have an idea and a drawing and an opinion that come together to convey that opinion. Memes can work the same way. It's not as creative a process, and I think the main distinction we're trying to draw is that editorial cartoonists working as opinion journalists are basing their opinions on facts. So they have to get their facts right about a given situation. They can't or shouldn't misrepresent them grossly or engage in distortive discourse. Whereas with memes, as we know, moments frozen in time are widely misrepresented, and they take on a kind of illusion of truth, right? Because they are so widespread that even the underlying narratives about a politician, for example, can take on a kind of truth just through that kind of mimetic misrepresentation, right? So I think that's one of the key distinctions we're trying to draw out here.
Great. I know that we are coming to an end here, so I definitely want to take time out to thank everyone for joining us this evening. A special shout out to Jordan Mays, my amazing colleague who helped organize and orchestrate this learning. Of course, to Adriana and to Molly. We appreciate not only your wisdom, but kind of deconstructing the lesson and how different parts relate not only to your students, but could be to different classrooms around the country, because we have people joining us from all over. So we appreciate your support, your connections. We learned that Adriana has been connected to some of these artists for a very long time. Mind blown. Of course, we want to reiterate thanks for the support from the Herb Block Foundation and the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists who supported this lesson. We are thrilled to bring it to your classrooms and to your students. And Peter, we'll try to get Lalo next year to join us for back to school webinar. Any final words you would like to say about the lesson? I'm going to pass this over to you.
Me? No, I mean, I'm thrilled as somebody who's worked on, every lesson that's on Checkology in some form or other. I mean, I think I'm really excited. And as a former social studies teacher who taught American history, I'm really excited for the reception among American history teachers and social studies teachers and journalism teachers. And as other colleagues have pointed out, art teachers as well. I think it opens up, some pathways. So even if you don't have room in your curriculum for this, or you're a ELA teacher and you're not going to tackle it, give it to your social studies teacher, suggest it to your art teacher. I think that's a great, exciting development for us.